Ďakujem. Teraz bude priestor, ako je dobrým zvykom, čas minimálne pol hodinu na diskusiu, takže predtým, ako si pripravíte svoje otázky, by som rád pripomenul pravidlá, ktoré panujú v našom prostredí. Takže kto má záujem, môže sa prihlásiť, dám pokyn asistentke a tam donesie mikrofón. Môžete sa predstaviť, to je dobrovoľné. Ale zároveň vás poprosím, aby ste povedali, v akom jazyku sa spýtate, či v slovenčine alebo v angličtine, aby sa mohol pán profesor na to pripraviť. A prosím, dodržte časový limit svojou konkrétnou otázkou alebo námetom 2 minúty, aby ostalo na čo najviac záujemcov. Takže kto má záujem, môže sa prihlásiť s otázkou. Vidím v druhom rade pán má záujem, takže nech sa páči.
My name is Jarojes. I am from Institute of Materials and Machine Mechanics, Slovak Academy of Sciences. Mr. Andersson, I would like to ask you on your opinion. According to my opinion, the huge problem in Europe in real estate entrepreneurship is the low quality of innovations in building industry, and these innovations are supported by huge public money. That's so that according to the results of R&D in the building industry, there are already technologies which will be utilized in 10 or 15 years in building industry, but another technologies are supported with huge money, such like photovoltaic, electromobility, or central heating system, or something like this. And that's why these new technologies cannot be so quick in the market. What do you think about this problem? That it is really so that such activities must be so strongly supported by public money. It is not better to do it with market, so that the best technologies will be on the market is rare. I don't know whether you understand.
Well, I mean, like, there's one thing I didn't take up here much, and there's something that Mr. Gonda here asked me to mention here. If you have a greenfield development, so like a new town and so forth, actually doing this within the private sector is not a problem. Why is that? Because then you have unified land ownership, so you don't have the transaction costs associated with, an old city with lots of property owners. Then, in those cases, it's actually possible to get, new technologies, new public goods, etc., planned purely privately, because all those effects will be capitalized in land prices, which means that they will make the properties more valuable. And if they're not, it means that the potential inhabitants do not value them enough, and that they shouldn't be making them in the first place. That's if you have a greenfield development. It's always a bit more difficult when we talk about large-scale systems, for example. That's sort of part of the infrastructure, right? It's more difficult if you're dealing with a city like the center or like the downtown area of Bratislava, maybe. You have lots of landowners, transaction costs will be prohibitive for people to, sort of coordinate their actions to get a new infrastructure, right? Like a public utility or a transportation network and so forth. And then probably you will need some sort of political funding of this. In other words, tax-funded investments and some sort of eminent domain regulation that says that the local government can, in order to construct a utility network or a road, they can actually expropriate some houses or some homeowners instead of the way if they get market compensation, the market value of whatever properties have to be expropriated. So that's sort of my general answer to the question. I don't know if it really addressed your question.
Many entrepreneurs, people who to customers. Many many entrepreneurs promise to customers how behave this house, this building, this hotel, and so on. And these customers pay for it, but it don't work from the point of view energy efficiency, from the point of view health, and so. And
Well,
for
then-
entrepreneurs, he obtain the money, and because the subventions are.
Well, if they promise something and they don't deliver what they promise, it seems like a case of fraud, right? So that should be dealt through the legal
Yes, it
system.
is so, and that's why the good business is this real estate entrepreneurship, because they only build the buildings and houses which are not usable.
So that
such
means
like-
that the laws against frauds are not strong enough, probably.
Quality is low because of subventions from the public money,
Yeah.
huge subventions in Europe.
Yeah,
Good evening, everyone. My name is Paolo. I would like to comment on and ask on 2 points you've mentioned. First was that Scandinavia, Australia, and UK is hugely regulated in terms of real estate. And the second point that was mentioned in the closing part of your talk was that you can't have multiple metro systems in possible. Well,
it's difficult, yeah.
yeah, it's difficult. So, if I'm allowed to ask a question about public transportation within the city, I used to work for half a year here in Bratislava. The public transportation, for instance, buses, trams, they have monopoly here. It's only one company, and it's a city company. Have you heard of things like public transportation system in Oslo, in Norway, which is in Scandinavia? So it might be different than in real estate. And they have only one operator, but they allow for, if I know correctly, 4 different companies that provide buses, and they compete among each other.
Well, that is actually much easier with bus systems than with metro systems. It's easier.
It's easy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because you have buses that, the roads are you have a lot of roads,
Mhm.
and it's quite easy to have competing, I think, bus services. But when you take transportation systems that uses rails, it's a bit more complicated.
How about trams? Do you know of some cases in maybe Europe, in other parts of the world, where, for example, trams, they also use rails? You know, tram? Is it called tram?
The trams, yeah.
So, would it be monopolistic competition or oligopolistic, or do you know?
Well, if you have a lot of operators, it would be monopolistic competition, right? Because then you have the close substitutes, but not perfect substitutes, right? So you would have a more competitive situation, but it's much easier to achieve for bus systems than for metro systems, right? Most of the metro systems tend to have one operator just because you have one set of tracks and it all has to be coordinated. It's much less flexible than a bus system, right? And also much more expensive. Well, I want to say something though about metro systems, and in one place where they've solved it quite well, and that's in Hong Kong, which is, as far as I know, is the only metro system where they don't need subsidies. And the reason is that they actually auction off the land near proposed metro stations, so they actually made the developers pay for the metro systems by the increased accessibility they will get by being close to the stations, right, for the investment. And then they have a private operator that tries to, make a profit running the trains, and they've been quite successful at that. So that means that they don't have any subsidy for operating expenses. At the same time, they manage to finance the investment through the sale of land near proposed stations. And that's not the usual situation, right? It's quite unique, but very successful, and it has a very relatively low prices, and a lot of people use the system.
Thank you. What was the city, please?
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. Thank you.
Nech sa páči, kto má ďalší záujem, môžete sa prihlásiť.
Ďakujem pekne, moje meno je Peter. Ako som dobre pochopil, tak hovorím slovensky. For sure.
Fortunately, I don't speak Slovak.
Ak som dobre pochopil, tak nie ste veľký priaznivec regulácie.
Okay. Ja.
Takže ak som dobre pochopil, že nie ste veľký priaznivec regulácie, výstavby alebo vôbec tohto riešenia, my sme práve v Bratislave trpeli, aspoň ja mám taký pocit na to, že tu tá regulácia nebola dostatočná. Výsledkom toho sú také vlastne výstavby vysokých budov na okrajoch mesta. Nie je to nejakým spôsobom príjemné pre obyvateľov, lebo osobne si myslím, že kvalita života nie je len otázka zisku, ale je to otázka aj príjemného prostredia a všetkého ostatného, kde tí ľudia žijú. Aký máte na to názor?
From a market perspective, I don't think it makes much sense to build high-rise buildings in suburban locations. It doesn't make any economic sense. I know two well-known examples of that. One is, I think, around Moscow in the old Soviet Union. They built a lot of high-rise buildings in suburban locations, but those were the results of central planning, not from market competition. Right? Likewise, they did the same around Stockholm in Sweden. You have, again, public housing in suburban location, subsidized housing with very high-rise sort of, high-rise character, unlike the center, which is low-rise, right? And to me, it seems like you don't have a functioning market if that happens, because it shouldn't happen. And if it's unpleasant, people's willingness to pay will go down, and that means that it's not a very profitable proposition for entrepreneurs, unless there is something wrong with maybe some subsidies or some legal uncertainties or some political decisions and so on. So a well-functioning market, in a well-functioning market you wouldn't find that.
Tomáš Kristofori. Hi, David. Do you have Bratislava in your implicit in that slide with the implicit tax rates?
I don't think so, right? No, I don't think there's data. I mean, you have to find the data, right? And I don't think I could find any data for Bratislava.
So, is it available anywhere?
Well, I mean, there is a very good database from Demographia, an American institute, but only for certain countries. You have all US cities, all UK cities, also Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan, but not continental Europe.
Okay, because, I just wonder, because that may perhaps...
That's housing though, not offices. Okay.
Yeah.
Offices I've only seen these cities in the literature.
Yes. I think what the audience asks is probably, that could be probably explained if you had the data for Bratislava, for these implicit tax rates. Or if you don't have that, perhaps why don't you tell us the difference between regulation and self-regulation? Because I think that there is some bias here in the audience telling like, oh, there is lack of regulation, but what if there's some sort of self-regulation?
Well, as I said, self-regulation in a well-functioning market would not lead to high-rise apartment houses in suburban location. However, there could be a problem with some market solutions, which is that maybe the land values are so high in the center of Bratislava that it would be worthwhile to build high-rise buildings right in the center, and this might contradict some conservation values that might be really important for future generations, right? Which is not really reflected in market prices, maybe. So, I mean, I would personally be in favor of, land use policies that conserve historic districts and so on.
Maybe can you please give some examples of self-organized cities, for example, Houston, or examples of such private self-organized cities? Maybe would be useful for audience. If you say more about.
Okay, Okay, so I can give you some examples of, this is more like pure private regulation. In Hong Kong, there is an area called Discovery Bay, which was developed by a property developer, and it has several unusual features. It's located in a very scenic area near a bay, obviously, it's Discovery Bay. But also they decided maybe the people who want to live here, they don't want much noise, so we're going to ban automobiles from the area. They only have golf carts and bicycles and so on. And actually, it led to really high property values, and it's now considered one of the most attractive places to live in Hong Kong. This was, all utility networks and everything was privately planned and organized, right? There are also several examples from the United States. One of the most famous one is Reston in Virginia, a small city with a population of maybe 40 or 50,000 people, also privately planned, and everything was sort of recovered. The costs of providing the infrastructure and the parks and so forth was recovered through increasing land values. The properties become more valuable if you have an attractive environment, and therefore the developer can make a profit. However, there is always a problem, even in the Hong Kong and the US case, in that even though these people, the property developers, provided the infrastructure, they still have to pay as much to the city in taxes for infrastructure as everyone else, even though they benefit to a lesser extent from things that are in other areas, right? So there is a kind of a disincentive built into the system here against private development because you can't get a tax rebate if you provide it yourself.
Ďalší má zájem, nech sa páči. Pán v treťom rade.
Thank you. Dear Professor, one so-called school question. Real estate capital you divided to physical, human and social. Please, which indicators do you use for human and social mostly?
Well, this is more a sort of conceptual discussion. Human capital is thus that you get, if you get a job and you get a higher salary because of your skills, that would normally be human capital if it's the skills you have. But if it's the case that it's your network, the people you know who you can contact if you need a problem to be solved, that would actually be a part of the social capital with a market value too, which would be sort of embedded in the salary you receive. Likewise, if we think about buildings, you cannot make a similar distinction as I tried to show earlier, right? So does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Nech sa páči, v prvom rade na stredu.
Thank you for the lecture, and I wanted to ask your opinion about sharing economy, Airbnb and stuff like this, if it helps maybe with some, helps solve some problems with planning, or maybe if it's possible to put it to some form of capital, as you mentioned, this division of capitals.
I think Airbnb is a very good example of entrepreneurial innovation in the real estate market. And while I was waiting for this lecture to begin, I was in my room and watching the news on TV, and they actually interviewed the founder of Airbnb there, and he was giving examples of new innovations they wanted to introduce, like high-rent properties, or more like instead of living in someone's apartment, you have some sort of mixture, like a hotel with more home feeling and with more special interior decoration, etc. So I think that's a very good example of something that has emerged sort of spontaneously as an entrepreneurial innovation. Yeah.
Nech sa páči, vpredu, ľavo.
Hello, my name is Peter. Thank you very much for your lecture. This will be in English. So I have two questions. One is more technical about the statistical part of your study. So I was wondering, in your regression, what was the proxy for the regulation you used and how strong it was comparing to other regressors that you had in your equation?
The equation was about the hotel market in Shanghai, so there is no, it's all the same, right? So it's the same regulation, so that's not, you can't really estimate any effect there, right? So the other example of implicit tax was not done by me, so I don't know exactly how they did it.
Okay, so then I'll switch to the second question regarding to London. As I understand that British are very conservative people. They want to sort of preserve the nature of the neighborhoods, how they know it. It's similar to what gentleman mentioned over there. It's not only about profit, but also the way we perceive the environment and the quality of life. So my question is whether the regulation over there, even if it wasn't there, whether the nature of the London, how it evolved, would hinder the entrepreneurial freedom anyway. Because your point is give freedom to entrepreneurs and they will improve the neighborhood, they will improve products, services, and help the city to flourish. My question is whether being the city conservative would itself, even without regulation, give certain boundaries to such a development. The examples in the pub area, simply there wouldn't be space for some very new I don't know, sporting activity venue or something like that, you know?
Well, if everybody hates tall buildings, there's not going to be any tall buildings. That's just the way the market works. But the thing is that if you have a market, you have a diversity of opinion. And I bet that not every single British person is very conservative, right? So you will have a diversity of neighborhoods, I would say, and it would sort of reflect the diversity of the population in a way, especially when it comes to housing markets, because housing markets has a lot to do with what kind of environment you want in your neighborhood. It's a little bit different if you think about office markets, because mostly people who want to buy offices and so on, they're more focused on profitability. So if it makes sense to build a high-rise building, for example, for kind of profitability, for the profitability of a firm, probably most would be willing to have an office in a high-rise building. Right? So I think it depends on, if you're talking about utility-seeking households in the housing market or profit-seeking firms in the commercial and industrial markets. But obviously, if everybody is conservative in every area of their life, and they all like very traditional housing and very low-rise housing, that's what you're going to get. But as soon as you have a diversity of opinions and a diversity of preferences, which is normal in markets, right, you will have a diversity of neighborhoods.
Thank you very much for the lecture. My name is Martin Reguli. I'm from the Smart Consumer Institute and also working with the FA Hayek Foundation. I would like to ask about getting back to the issue of transportation in the cities. I mean, oftentimes one of the arguments about physical road infrastructure and the limits on basically competitiveness in terms of market solution for transportation. What should be the role then of, say, municipalities in terms of setting framework maybe for the different options? Now we have electric scooters, bike sharing, electric cars, public transportation, mass transportation. What is the place where the municipality should have, what is the role for it? And where it can be actually efficient, or if it should basically outsource even the management to some third party, or what would you like to see happen, or what do you think is the most efficient way of going around?
Well, as I said, I think a place with very much public transportation is Hong Kong, and it's sort of publicly funded, but they did it in a really smart way there, right? They had the property developers pay for it, and then they have a private operator who's not subsidized. So that's a very good, very kind of good solution, but which is also sort of supportive of public transportation. But on the other hand, we also have to remember that people have different values. So if you're someone who really likes automobiles, you're not going to be very happy in Hong Kong because they have very high taxes on that. And I think we should respect the diversity of opinions so that what is good for one type of household is not necessarily good for another type of household, right? So one of the things that I have proposed in one of the papers I wrote in the past is that actually political fragmentation might sometimes be a good idea in a metropolitan area, because you can have one sort of neighborhood or district of the city that strongly favors public transportation, another that is more car-oriented and so forth. There are, of course, inefficiencies associated with fragmentation because there are certain scale economies that you can achieve, but maybe you can gain more in terms of diversity than you lose in terms of not being able to take advantage of all scale economies.
Again, so connected to the last question, so what's the difference between what you just described and the city of San Francisco, where you have the zone planning, different ways, how like the downtown is like the maximum floor level in the downtown is different than in other parts of town. So is that any different?
Well, the zoning in the Californian cities, including or maybe especially San Francisco, is extremely strict by U.S. standards. And as a matter of fact, it's very difficult to get planning permission for a new residential development in any city in the San Francisco region. And that's one of the driving factors behind the low affordability, or like the unaffordability of housing in San Francisco. It's also the case, I read an article about this, that if you think there might be, let's say, an environmental problem with a new property development, it's enough for one person, it could be a high school student, to raise this issue locally, and this could delay the project by maybe 10 years, right? So the supply of new housing is extremely inelastic because of this, even though they have zoning regulations, right? So maybe in the past they had a relatively market-oriented mixture of activities, but the regulations have increased over time. So right now it's very difficult to develop anything in San Francisco, and actually in almost every single area in California. California, together with Hawaii, are the two most extreme states in the U.S. Much more extreme than the states on the East Coast.
Tak potom by som chcel poďakovať vám, že ste prišli, že ste si vypočuli prednášku, ktorá určite bola pre vás prínosná, zaujímavá. Chcem ešte raz poďakovať partnerom za ich podporu a spoluprácu. No a predovšetkým chcem poďakovať pánovi profesorovi. Thank you very much for your lecture and discussion. Thank you very much.